I made a video recently on the imperial cult in Julio-Claudian times, as well as, you must recognize that I still have to make videos on that topic, but again, the same Christianity is born in that very heart of not the Roman Empire randomly in time and space, but literally fulfilling the Evangelion of the universal religion in that specific Augustan situation. One cannot understand that. The entire meaning of Christianity is pointless, right? If you don't know that. And again, do you think that an average person, Christianity is declining in the world? I think Christians are like 64%. But that's the point, in fact. What's the point of believing in something that you don't, that obviously you don't understand the meaning of? And whose fault is that? If not yours. But in any case, Roman ideology, as we've seen, was centered on this conviction of her own divinity. You can argue that in the world it matured over time, as we've seen the Romans were always convinced of that. But what cannot be denied is that it became self-evident in the moment in which the Empire of Rome was created. Of course, the universal empire was owned, again, even by that aforementioned tribal chieftain at the outskirts of Europe, as long as he reigned on anything. But the question is that the Roman Empire was so enormous by scale that there was literally no real boundary to it. And again, even that chieftain would unavoidably behave the way it did because Rome existed, right? And you can't make the case that the other way around is also true, but by scale still, what force made more leverage? I think we have the answer there. So as a medievalist, I must say this, that probably the hardest thing to understand when we look at the Enlightenment kind of, let's say, partly humanistic, but it's mostly the Enlightenment that shaped our view of the same Middle Ages, is profoundly devoid of the awareness of the fact that in the Western world, the Roman Empire was never considered to have ended. And I'm not just talking about the Byzantine Empire, I'm talking about what they really believed, not what we don't understand anymore today, what they actually believed being always there as a force given by God. And that's why, again, the Germans recreated a Roman Empire, not a German Empire. They titled it like that. And there was a very specific reason. You can see the contingencies of it, the fact that it was still a papal, creation by some sort, that was still a Roman Empire in Constantinople, whatever. But the point is that this would be to vilify the thing to a mere international, almost diplomatic thing, or just political influence. This was the raison d'etre of all the peoples that had always lived in Europe. The empire existed before Rome and after Rome. It was in everybody's minds and hearts and souls. Again, look at the European names. Our onomastics, we all have military names. I have a military name. I have a military surname. They come respectively from the Hellenic and the Germanic. How can't you feel them to be part of your own culture in any way? Right? All the Latin names are military. Where now all the Germanic names are military, or the Slavic names are military, or the Celtic names. Even when the meaning seems like it's just a color, for example, or an animal, if you look at the mythology of that, you realize that it's all part of this imperial say, hierarchy. And to me, it's an incredible evidence, right? Given that nobody had ever made me notice it, or at least it's something that nobody commonly discusses. Why do you think the empire is so important? Of course, there is plenty of reasons also in a just neurocognitive sense, evolutionarily, biologically, whatever. Tradition addresses them as well. So there are lots of reasons why humans want to make sense of chaos and want to impose their own empire, plant their own labyrinth on a conquered land of sort. We just have forgotten that this thing happened to a scale that mankind has never seen afterwards. In a moral sense, which is the only space where also tradition considers that any accomplishment can be obtained. There was no border in the Roman Empire. Rome considered herself the ruler of all known lands and peoples, and only allowed her hegemony to be exercised with different intensities and nuances, right? But without ever completely disappearing. Again, the same powerful defensive measures of the imperial era, the wall in Germany, those of Hadrian and Antoninus in England, the river patrols on the Danube, the fortifications in the African deserts, the belt of allied states which acted as a buffer. These all testify that the strategic design of Rome was based on the principle of economy of forces, which, and this is the entire psychology of believing that you are the chosen people, a principle of economy of forces, politically and strategically, is the exact opposite of a defensive and isolationist mentality. Rome never stopped to believe that she could expand. It was off the table. Nobody could conceive that in those times. Practical problems would naturally, essentially put a strain to human capacities. So keeping this empire together was enormously difficult. But first of all, Rome succeeded for an extraordinary long time with, again, the means of the time. Here, you can't coerce people. Think about how impactful states are, not just with nuclear weapons, but just with gunpowder technology. Here we're talking about the Iron Age. And entire regions of Europe kept under. Some of the most thriving centers of the Mediterranean just being actually lasting for even millennium under Rome. Just the scale of it geographically is impressive. Just think in making it work in practice with the means of the communications of the time. But especially, again, there was no trace in here of any sort of defensivism or isolationism. Defensivism and isolationism derive from inferiority. If you do not have the initiative, if you want just to entrench yourself and closing your eyes, you cannot achieve anything. It means that you're scared, that you fear, that you're not the hero. You're the chthonic mass. And history is implacable in this regard. Whoever acted like this essentially came to be prey of someone else because it was giving up the initiative. The Romans never had this, but not only, but what is important here is that they conferred further the West that already had naturally the ingredients for this recipe, that sense of that we still have, and I think that's also why we are, generally speaking, the least paranoid culture in the world. absolutely confident in our aggressiveness, in the right of ruling over other peoples that were actually much more violent than us in practical terms, but just because they didn't know how to use that violence, because they were indisciplined, where we knew how to, without even having to record it, thanks to deterrence, state building, and so on. The point is that to us, like, I think it's normal that there is an order. It's normal that there is a head. It's normal that there is an army. It's normal that there is a participation, right? What we call democracy improperly, because nor in Rome the plebs ever ruled, nor de facto also in Greece the demos did. And when it happened, actually was disastrous and was just an exception in that case. But there was this constant awareness of, again, the redemptive value of this rule, of the imperium per se. The Roman legions were brought to the edges of the world because these were men who were given a chance, again, to partake divine rule under their chosen leaders. And they were, by getting something back of it, concretely acquiring power, concretely cultivating their own freedom, but within an order, a liberty. As a matter of fact, was deeply felt be the core of the political values before absolute freedom, and thus lack of any rule, and relativism and subjectivism and all the worst possible things today are seemingly the thing. All rights without duties nullify any right in practice. The Roman munus instead was about a duty and a reward at the same time. And Rome, that was, again, just a city, managed to become Romans how many times larger the amount of population. And how? By threatening them to the point of the sword? If you think so, you're just looking at the tip of the iceberg of what Rome promised to the world, and why also Christianity was born under Rome, and why what we believe in the West has made us achieve what we did. If one doesn't see this, it's obvious that, again, you get straight into National Socialism, in communism, in statualism, in collectivism, in the idea that, again, you live under a superstition, persecuted by somebody else without any capacity of your own, fearful, scared, paranoid, passive-aggressive, disoriented, ignorant, poor. Why? Because you have given up absolute standards. You have given up the truth. There would be a lot of religious considerations to historically make about this, and the delicate changes that sometimes actually brutal changes, but say overall this also hardly felt or distinguishable in the very times, right? Changes that Roman spirituality underwent. Is not to say that this thing eventually ended well, right? Or at least nothing ends well. So it's perfectly normal, but it's not to oppose to anything that has ever ended well, because things never end well, just because they end. So this mentality again. So if people are habituated just in everything is going to be fine anyway, you're just, again, probably telling to you the greatest lie of all. And you're losing in the process, because you are the one who doesn't really, do anything for deserving anything. And so when something bad happens to you, why would you even lament yourself? Yes, it's painful. but you made it happen practically. So say that if the expansion of the borders of the imperial era is small compared to the insatiable series of conquests of Republican Rome, which also technically never existed as the Republic, but we understand it didactically this way, the reason does not lie in a lesser effectiveness of the legions either. So the military instrument that we will come to discuss, hopefully in this series, is to be understood as effectively to some standards that were not fundamentally intrinsic just in a specific type of army, right, or equipment or whatever than another in itself, right, but to the purpose that this military instrument was used for and so developed for, and the force behind it. Thus, as we've seen, the effort to keep the empire together was somehow greater even than the single conquests that were carried out. Right, at least it was also more continuative, was also arguably more successful because Rome wasn't made in a day. Literally, there were lots of setbacks in perspective. But in absolute terms, again, the accomplishments were nothing short of extraordinary. So, or rather, what we see in the difference between Republican and Imperial times regarding the stop of the expansion is that the cause resides in the unfavorable relationship that had by then consolidated between the cost of a new expansion, in particular that of its maintenance, that is greater on the longer run, right? It affects, let's say, the system in absolute terms more than just one war once, right? Eventually, much more has to be paid continuously, and it becomes also, in that sense, more difficult to justify, right? Why is there here a Roman government if I don't get anything back, right? And that's why the success of Romanization in many ways. And thus there was a concern about the benefits it would bring under many points of view. One may think just the economical one, but also the military ones as well. What is a legion doing somewhere exactly, right? And how does that represent, in that sense, a frontier? And what's the relation with local peoples? This is very important to stress. There was no such like a Roman box that it's all alike. Rome was ruling over. This was most likely most precisely like a sort of feudal hierarchy, rather than again a state or a nation or people, because of course there was a degree of that, don't get me wrong, it's not a mistake to think that, but it's our cognitive bias that makes us see the Romans kind of all alike, all this history completely flat or superficial or somehow there is Rome but just something else, right? This misses the point entirely, especially the one of life, of the people that lived there, and that we all somehow descend from. That is why the Rome of the Caesars learned to think in more subtle terms, right? Creating an empire based on different shades of political sovereignty, ranging from areas of Roman citizenship to senatorial provinces, and then down to the puppet states, allied states, and peoples with whom simple non-aggression pacts were signed. That is essentially showing the degree of, say, who is Roman and what power he has around himself. Right, certain areas, starting from Italy, of course, were the ones where full Roman citizenship was given, probably also on a territorial base. This would be extended to entire provinces later on. That's where you still have some kind of empire in the idea that, of course, this wasn't born with Augustus, that rather created a monarchy in an institutional form, but the imperium was just grown from the entire Roman political culture, tradition, religion. You have provinces that are used essentially as huge latifundia, some that are much more military in nature. But gradually the people that inhabit in all this become Roman in a way or another. There are colonies that are deduced from Italy. There are peoples that earn citizenship by fighting alongside the legions. So technically just the Romans, juridically, right, the ones that have the full citizenship. And just cultural osmosis. There are lots of peoples at some point that are somehow distant from Rome, so they're not really Romanized in the Italic sense, but they still mind Rome. They care about her having the borders, trying to avoid being conquered, but also giving something else in exchange, and or they resist and they go at war. But it's complicated, and so there are also peoples that Rome has relations with that would never actually bring to any direct confrontation, intervention. I mean, China and Rome habitually, negotiate. I mean, they had some agreements, especially about international trade, as you understand, and so on. But again, that was to a scale in which the Romans were really not involved in a direct sense. So again, their world was already huge to an extent that you said, literally, what does basically a Romano-Briton has to do living, let's say, on the Irish Sea to do with a Romano-Egyptian living on the Red Sea. They are so different realities. I mean, there are Roman temples in Malabar. Those were Roman merchants that created colonies on their own on the West Indian coast and lived there. So it's the influence of Rome in this regard is so vast that speaks for the same effectiveness of the empire, because this thing was held over peoples, was not just an idea. It was an actual government, an actual army, an actual economical power, and it made itself felt to an unprecedented scale. So this domain was made up of gradations, as we just observed, which had the indisputable advantages of containing conflicts within acceptable limits, because leaving the control of marginal territories to the Allies and consequently drastically reducing the number of troops necessary to maintain sovereignty was also a way to, again, make these peoples more responsible for themselves. It was a double-edged sword in a sense, but the fact that Rome could simply threaten you and telling you, well, I could even occupy you, could even wipe your country out of the face of the earth. The Romans did this. The Romans threatened the same local deities that if they had not supported Rome, the Romans would have destroyed them, so that they had to open the gates to Rome. Just think this mentality, right? So the fact that Rome would give you trust, that those who held the divine power would tell you, you can rule here, brings with itself a moral effect that can hardly be just countered just surely in a practical sense. Roman client states were perfectly aware of what would happen to them if they had betrayed Rome, and in that case it was really better avoiding the thing. But the fact of having been offered a chance and not just being treated like the next slave was important to that sort of manumission, because de facto you were under Roman threat, right? But at the same time you had a chance to participate to that order and sharing the benefits. So that's how the thing became sustainable economically, socially, and militarily, because, as you know, so the majority of the Roman army was always made in any age by more non-Romans than Romans, because all these people essentially flocked to be given that opportunity to open those gates when they realized that Rome was a more profitable idea for all the spiritual and material reasons that this could entail. And given, again, the degree of civilization that was spread, especially in Western Europe, by Rome, and consolidated further, and also osmotically spread in less kind of advanced areas, there can be no more relatively, say, relativistic approach to the results that this brought. Resisting to Romanization is not any more than saying, resistance to the West nowadays, right? You can see a degree of corruption of the morals of that, but that still derives from the possibility of countering it through the same power that the system holds. That's why people tend to be in denial towards Rome and self-hatred by saying, but Rome, how did they make it? They have to invent the strangest things. It's because they were richer. Yes, and how was Rome capable of taking over, the entire world? Because Rome was on the top of an Everest high, mountain of gold, right? No, wait, it's technology. Oh, yes, because, notoriously the Romans were more technologically advanced than the Greeks, and, without technology you couldn't really do anything. They had the same weapons basically any other people in Europe had, but no, it must be technology, man. It's damn technology, and those anti-traditionalist people are just, the Romans were evil. They were more evil. So you buy the culturalist bullshit. So, okay, you rule because you're evil. So all the other people are right, good, etc., but they're stupid because they're not evil. So they have to end up conquered. Oh, look at the Romans. They made spectacles when there were people who were eaten alive by lions. Well, yes, and Germanic chieftains, made naked boys running in, among spears until somebody got, trusted in it. That's normal, right? But they had slavery. Like the Roman Empire was built on slavery. Yeah, because I don't know what country didn't have slaves at the time, and where's the evidence that the Romans were kind of worse with slaves than any other people? We're pretty much the same, right? There is also an extensive amount of evidence that slavery from Britain to Persia to whatever was pretty rough, and the entire system was based on slavery. The entire mythology was accepting that the stronger had to rule on the weaker. It was particularly intense among peoples like the Teutons, the Cimbrians. It was completely normal. The reason why Rome conquered all the world is that it was a morally superior culture that had understood, of course, the necessity of keeping up some standards that could never be betrayed, because that was the only way to take over the world. You say, but why did this happen? Still doesn't answer the question. I believe that has to do with the inherent conflictuality of Italy, the fact that there was an important civilizational influence from other countries, etc. But these are just deterministic explanations. Here we cannot ignore, as I explained in that video about the greatest superiority of Roman civilization, etc., that there was an active choice by an establishment to side towards the Uranic tradition of the Indo-European conquerors. And that Rome topped this, for reasons that, again, of course, are connected deeply with Roman politics, how the nobility maintained a specific control on the city, what the capacity of this model was able to push forward and reinforcing itself in the process, but it's due to a choice. It's not due to a random factor, right? That there were, again, more powerful people than Rome from very long time before her, and these didn't perform in the same way. And again, I'm not saying that I can liquidate the answer so easily. But that's why I made a 3.5 hours long video, just to approach the answer in the aforementioned video, right? And that's why I also am discussing this, because again, even if you look at Rome per se, it's obvious that the world was pretty similar at the time, from one place to another. At the end of the day, there were important differences for ancient standards, but again, the Roman legionnaire doesn't particularly differ from, again, the average continental warrior in concept, right? It just is perfected. It can be sustained by a more powerful system, but the system is politically and socially built, and so it's not the economy or the technology or the evil, which actually, especially the latter, sounds as a pretty stupid idea, because, in that way, I don't know, any human achievement would be due to evil, basically, because I can see the thing otherwise. And what would be there the pride from any nationalistic accomplishment about your own country in the fields of civilization, if this was due to evil? The Romans were not even, on average, more warlike, saying again. Tribes were much more fiercely harsher and violent, and yes, they did carry out human sacrifice, and the Romans did as well, but it's no like, if you have studied well Celtic mythology, the Gaelic Fiannas before the Germanic Comitas, by default that their culture was based exclusively on war, and that they carried this out in some of the most viciously ferocious, abusive, because there was no other way to make it work, by the way. You can't create a Germanic Comitatus if you don't traumatize psychophysically a person to destroy it as a human being and recreating it as a killing machine. This is not an interpretational opinion. This is literally what they did. Like, we know that their entire world was based on this, so the question is, the hell are you even talking about? And what kind of moral standards do you have to deny the single greatest accomplishment in human civilization just because maybe, I don't know, you need to stress that you somehow lost personally something in the process? I hardly think so. I think we should rather be thankful towards Rome. For in a world of radical brutality that also the Romans surely displayed, there was something more elevating from that Chthonic Dionysian rage. There was reason, there was virtue, there was beauty, there was intelligence. You don't rule an empire that size just even in order to maintain the army deployed, supplied, and employing it strategically in the way it does if you're not an intelligent system, if you're not a real civilization, if you don't really know how to make things work at levels that others can only dream of. By quality and scale, because that's where it gets down to. So it's really not the Romans having copied technology from others that has made Rome, right? If anything, that's just actually something we should compliment the Romans for, but realizing being the obvious consequence of a previous accomplishment. Among the many reasons for Roman invincibility, this is perhaps the most important, but also the most difficult to grasp and imitate. It's spiritual force. And these are Jungian principles. They go far beyond they are properly the Apollonian elevation of the soul, that has to be reached through war, which is again unavoidable for any other population mythology, it's again extremely clear. Read about the role of the Filzia in the Norse mythology, read about the Furies or the Erinyes in the Hellenic one, the Fravashis in the Veda. I mean, there is no other thing but war. All these cultures were based on war as the primary pride, identity, and purpose of their entire existence. The entire world was and should still be seen as a struggle, as an intrinsic struggle between good and evil loses. So it's a bit insulting also towards like the enormous cultural legacy that Rome has left us and informed us as Westerners to claim that a religion that is entirely based on this principle is, and just like all the others, is somehow guilty of evil just because they were better than the others in accomplishing what all the others would have liked to have and not having. Like, you can easily see that the moral relativism of the process when every people today wants to claim that their people was better than the others. But does any of those set some criteria for this? I think Schwerpunkt mostly concerns itself with it, and that's why I make these videos. What else to say? This is definitely not over. Surely I'm splitting the video in two parts, because it's way more important than it seems. For centuries to come, kings and leaders would study the deeds of the legions, trying to reproduce their forms of recruitment. Think about during the Renaissance, even though in absolute terms the military model was more advanced, but the training, the tactics, the idea that the military culture of the Romans had achieved the empire, and that's the right understanding, historically speaking. But only rarely was the greatest secret understood. Roman greatness stood in an unceasing strategy of conquest, aggressive only when necessary, but always judicious and patient. It's not about projecting you beyond your own limits. It's testing your limits and pushing forward. And when you reach a limit not physically meant, there are other challenges, such as keeping what you attain together, that pushes your limits further. And that's also how civilization grows. And again, I think the world should tremble in front of what Rome achieved, for just what we can dispose of now in all fields. Not, again, the list of inventions. The Romans invented this or that. Very often they didn't invent anything. It's what they managed to put together and keeping, so that in all fields should be really looked with a bit more intelligence and awareness and humility too, considering what we have become. Rome, as we said, is quite evidently the most pragmatic power exists. Probably it's a trait of Roman civilization, the most pragmatic one that we could ever conceive. Right? There are also, from a military point of view, certain aspects that can be observed from other countries that somehow invested more or less on the mirabilia, almost, the mirabilis, let's say, as opposed to the functional, the practical. The Romans conquered the world literally with a guy with an oval shield and a sword, right? And at best a coat of mail and an helmet. And so elephants, war chariots, even sophisticated torsion engines, whatever, couldn't stop these essentially Italic farmers that weren't, surely the level of particular individual, refinement per se. But they were a fierce people, and they had a hell of a leadership, and they were convinced legitimately that they were a chosen race who had the ultimate destiny of conquering the world. Sometimes it's the good enough that makes the thing, right? Based on the prudent use of forces, on the consolidated logistic structures, very often overlooked, on the power of information and disinformation, too, on the ability to react to critical situations, to circumscribe the outcomes of actually rare defeats, right? There are surely lots of famous Roman defeats that everybody knows, from the Battle of the Allia River, Cannae, the Carrhae, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. But if we look at them, like, none of these eventually prevented Rome from accomplishing her ultimate goal and what it left. And for not talking about the victories that actually are so many that people tend to count less. And that's an interesting attitude in our world, because, as I said before, we don't judge the ultimate accomplishment just by a single battle counts, but how are more people obsessed about the Roman defeat and trying to redimension Rome, to say that we're bad, we're evil, they're Nazis in the ancient world, but then not realizing again what a victory means in practice, right? And also how this world came to end practically, which brings very often to strange and exalted interpretations about how Rome ended. Rome didn't quite end properly, even physically, as a city, or as the entire Roman culture, in a sense. Like, you can't say that there was a tsunami and Rome is over, sorry, there's nothing here. Rome lived on throughout all the Middle Ages, even the modern age. I mean, great part of the history of the city is just essentially a consequence of what Rome was as the world. And after all, the dazzling victories of Rome, with their light, mask a cold political lucidity, which is the key to any great victories. The self-control of the hero is the rationale, is the wisdom, is the knowledge, but it's also the virtue, the courage, the persistence, which treasure tradition, also without becoming a slave to it. Tradition is not a dogma, tradition is action. And I think that this alone would be enough to make the greatest military in the history of mankind. We will talk again about this all at some point. For today, as we just have this introduction after all, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.